If you're a Pittsburgh baseball fan, then this is the podcast for you. Make your way down, grab a beverage, and get ready to talk Pirates with myself, Craig Toth, and Scott Jackson, two of the biggest fans you'll ever meet. This is Bucs in the Basement.
Now I see the changes in this town. They change, they say one thing, but then the next day it's different. They change, but they don't know what they want. All they do is change. Going left, going right, travel day, travel night. That's where we'll go. No excuses, no goodbyes, no one cries, no one lies. We'll never know.
We're entering what I see as possibly the worst part of the quote-unquote off-season for Pirates fans, because obviously we're not in the playoffs and we are watching other teams compete and compete very well. The Guardians with a dramatic comeback before we hopped on here tonight, getting to see, a place that's only 2 hours up the road, is in a similar quote unquote market, doesn't really spend a ton, as Scott had brought up before the show, where you have, how much each team that's left in the playoffs has on their payroll and is spending. But yeah, we pretty much roll into this place where if you listen to one Pirates podcast, you could probably say you've listened to them all. So we like to take a different look at things just to kind of give people an idea of why we're thinking the way that we're thinking about the decisions that are going to be made. And Scott, tonight we're going to be talking arbitration, which I know a lot of people have already kind of, put on pen to paper and have written about it, and people have talked about it, but definitely want to give our opinions on that as well.
Yeah, it's the doldrums of the off season because the Pirates can't do anything, and we're just kind of sitting here watching other teams succeed. And I saw the ownership of the Guardians called competent Bob Nuttings on X this week. To your point, how much they spend and how they don't like to spend. But if nothing else, your weekly 30 minutes of Bucs can be a safe space away from the barrage of political messages that we've all been inundated with nonstop. And so it's nice to be able to sit here and talk baseball with you.
Yeah, I love talking baseball, man. And that is kind of a good way to put the Guardians succinctly almost. And for a while there, the Guardians were what the Pirates are right now. And that's a pitching factory. And they were able to turn those pitchers over in some trades to get some very useful pieces. Something I've discussed, many a times. I believe that some of these teams that rebuilt had at least bigger headliners on some of their trades, and the Guardians have done well with that and have not really shied away from those types of things. And unfortunately, in this business, I mean, I started the podcast talking about money, and we will continue to talk about money because we are a Pittsburgh Pirates podcast. And I will say, I mean, as soon as those ARB numbers came out, one of the first things, my eyes went straight to it, and I think that a lot of other people's did as well. And I saw, David Bednar, $6.6 million as an estimate. And for anybody that doesn't, follow MLB trade rumors, this is something they've been doing for a very long time. And for the most part, I mean, they fall within like a couple $100,000 one way or another. As to where, I mean, usually what the player gets or where, the estimates land for when, the numbers are exchanged for the players and the teams. I mean, sometimes we do see teams, lowball a little bit, and that's where the arbitration actually comes in, because I mean, we don't need to explain it. I feel like a lot of people know it, but this is the process. We're not even in arbitration now. Arbitration only happens if you can't agree on those numbers. It's an absolutely ugly process where you walk in and your team, who you want to still play for, or at least have to still play for because they tendered you a contract, will then browbeat you into submission by saying all of the bad stuff that you have done during the previous year or previous years. And for me, that $6.6 million, I think that for other teams, it may not be as shocking as Pirates fans looking at how much they paid, Aroldis Chapman last year, $10.5 million. It maybe takes a little bit of that sting off, but then also it's not like David Bednar's coming off of another All-Star season, where his ERAs in the threes, his WHIPs in the low like 1.1s. I mean, we're looking at a guy whose numbers are not even close to that. You got a over 6 ERA or close to 6 ERA, and then the whips sitting consistently like around what you wouldn't even want, from your fifth starter, a 1.422 and that ERA 5.77. Did you have, the same reaction that I did, Scott?
I did. It shocked me for the same kind of reason. You put in perspective how much they are projected for Bednar's projected for, and then compare it to what other guys are making, like Chapman, for example, as you mentioned. Um, but that his agent is going to go in if it does go to arbitration and say he's been one of the top closers in the National League for the previous 2 years. He had a bad year, so you really got a deal on those first couple years. So there, he's going to spin it that way. I think that the best thing that they could do is maybe if you're going to bet on him figuring it out, or at least figuring it out long enough that you can flip him, which I think might be the smartest way to go. Is do you maybe buy out a couple years of arbitration? Don't even let it get to the actual arbiter, and where feelings can get hurt, and like you said, you bring up every little thing. He doesn't clean out the refrigerator at work or what, lets the stuff go bad. Like every little thing is getting brought up in that. But I think that maybe not letting it get to the full end of the process and actually signing an extension of 2 years or so, which we saw Nutting, actually say that he wanted done for Reynolds a few years ago before the actual extension was signed, um, because he's a Pittsburgh guy. Whether or not that buys him a longer leash, which we think maybe it has, um, because of where he's from. Uh, you don't want to continue the bad PR that they are so perfect at. It's just a natural to the Pittsburgh Pirates to make bad PR moves, and so maybe to counteract that, you do that so you don't have one of your hometown guys get run down in front of himself and in the media.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you on that, and that's where like Nutting, he has gotten a little bit of a bad rap, with certain things, but he does want to do well by his players, with what he did with Reynolds, because he saw that what the team was offering, what Reynolds was looking for, and didn't want it to get to that ugly place, and I think that he would do the same for Bednar. Now maybe Bednar, don't know. Like obviously his agents would advise him against it, but him realizing he had a bad year and not looking at that $6.6 million and maybe be able to meet somewhere in the middle of the 4.5 that he made this year and the 6.6. But I think for the Pirates, I mean, if you could, get him to sign that extra year at a reasonable cost and then hope he performs and make the right decision to flip him. And you would be looking at, flipping him to a team where, that one extra year of control would look good to them. And especially if, after a good year, I should say after a bad year, it already goes up by a couple $1 million if he would have a very good year again. I mean, you could see that go up by about 4 million. So if you could get an extension that kind of somewhere falls in the middle of that, where, both years are quote unquote kind of cheap, that may make it look a little bit more interesting, for a team that would be taking him on. I, they're going to have to tread lightly with this one, just because, like you said before, the bad PR, and it'd be nice if they could, before they actually have to exchange those numbers, could get something worked out, because those numbers, are made public. And if Pirates fans see David Bednar saying, well, I didn't perform that terribly, as well as I wanted to, but I do have those couple good years. I'm looking for $6 million, and the Pirates come in with like a solid 5 or something. I know that Pirates fans, it'll make a mess on Twitter. It'll be another, public lashing for Bob Nutting and Ben Cherington, and that's the last thing that you want to see there.
Yeah, and let's not overestimate or underestimate the power of how boring the off season can be and how much of a slow roll that it is. So they're gonna have to have something to talk about through the off season, and so even if it isn't a big deal, Pirates Twitter or X or whatever is gonna make it a big deal. And also, I think one of the things that you and I both pride ourselves in when we're talking about these things are that we live in reality. And I think we should probably, and I guess I can't speak for you, and also I'll ask you if you agree with me. They're not going to non-tender David Bednar. I don't even see that as a possibility. And so I just make sure that because you hear it brought up, by people online of just non-tendering him, but that's not. I don't think that's an option.
No, man. I if that happened, I mean, I would literally fall out of my bar stool right now. I'd fall right off of it if that type of decision was made. Just because you do have a guy who has done it well for a couple years. And I believe the Pirates probably realized that they messed with him a little bit at the beginning of the season, which threw him off. He did pitch well for the few months after that. He got back to a little bit of himself with kind of resting. I don't know if it was June or July. It was one of those months. He only pitched about 6 or 7 innings in that month, pitched very well. And you could tell that he kind of, needed the rest, ended up, tweaking something again. And then also kind of hanging him out to dry by leaving him in, the closer role for as long as they did when they even realized that he didn't have it. So, yeah, I mean, that non-tender thing, that's kind of out the window. I think probably we should move on to the guys that have also been brought up, as non-tenders. Number one, I mean, I think it's going to be a non-tender. I don't think it's any question in my mind is Ben Heller for $1 million. Just came out, had one of the most atrocious, first outings that a Pirate could have. I mean, his ERA was, I think, sitting up at like 45 or something at that point in time. And, I believe that he is possibly a depth piece or potential professional pitcher, but just not something that, I mean, 1 million, I know it's not much money, but I mean, when I said we're living in reality here, if you can pinch that penny, and you can get that $1 million back and go out and, pick somebody up or pull somebody up from AAA and pay them the league minimum, I mean, you're going to do that.
Yeah, you could replace that production pretty
The next one, and like I said, this one breaks my heart, but it's Connor Joe, $3.2 million. I mean, looking at it right here, right now, I mean, at the end of the season, his OPS, sitting below 700. The first half of the season, it was 729 home runs. Second half of the season, 603, 2 home runs. Just kind of almost for him even looked lost at the plate because, I mean, I think that's one thing that he usually prided himself in is that giving that professional at bat. And I felt like during the second half of the season, that was something that was just completely lost. And for $3.2 million, uh, it's not saying that he won't latch on someplace else, because I think he will. It's just saying that that may be a little bit too much money to spend on a guy who, for the second half of the season, for the second year in a row, kind of slid off the map.
And that's indicative of Connor Joe. He did it in Colorado too. He's a half a year player. He gets overexposed. I don't know the answer to it. We've talked about it in previous weeks. These are human beings, so who knows what gets in their head and causes them to fall off a cliff like that. But yeah, save the 3.2 million, and that'll go a long ways towards covering some of these extensions that are kicking in, these raises that our guys are getting. But Pirate fans should be prepared, because if he does go somewhere else and plays, you'll probably hear about it in the first half. But I'm sure by the end of the year, he'll fade back like he usually does. And I love him as a character, as a person. He seems great. But hey, it's a business, and $3.2 million is nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, and you have to, if you're going to be bad at one aspect of the game, you have to excel at the other aspect of the game. And yes, he's a guy that could, play right field. Also, they put him in center field a couple times, which was an adventure, kind of to say the least. Didn't, look terrible out there, but I mean, yeah, not something you want to see every day, and could play first base, but did not excel, at either position. So, I mean, I hate to say it, I feel like he's probably, one of those top non-tender candidates. And this other guy is somebody that, has been mentioned a lot as well, and that's Brian De La Cruz at $4 million, just because how poorly he performed, and once he came over to Pittsburgh. And not that he is this, he was this great player with Miami either. I think that the Pirates were hopeful when he came over that he could at least maintain that. Because I even said it at the time. I believe that if he maintained that, it was an obvious upgrade over how other people were performing. Wasn't great. He had a 707 OPS in Miami, did have those 18 home runs, saw a 514 OPS here, only 3 home runs, and always seemed to be at like the least opportune times. It was like, we're up by 10 runs, you'll get a Brian De La Cruz home run. We're down by 10 runs, you'll get a Brian De La Cruz home run.
Garbage
So,
time home runs. Yeah.
yeah, so just nothing either way. And I mean, just from my perspective right here, and this is kind of like where I think that Ben Cherington's mindset goes, is that, I mean, the team is always looking for power. Yes, he did not provide it when he was with, the Pirates, but 20 home runs, 21 home runs. It's not something that, a lot of players on the Pirates were able to provide this year. So
Correct.
if you can get offense anywhere, you kind of want to see that happen, especially with the power. I mean, obviously, as a right-handed hitter, you could see that his profile wouldn't play as well in PNC Park. It's a tough place for right-handed hitters. But in my eyes, I would hope that he would not make that $4 million and would, agree to or settle for, something a little bit less. But on the other hand, before we hopped on here, you already know, I believe that they are going to tender him. And there's going to definitely be some backlash about that, but I just want people to be prepared for it,
Yeah.
because I just don't see them, no matter how badly he performed in Pittsburgh, that they will, sneeze at 21 home runs and just let him walk.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, something we were talking about beforehand is, where does he fit in the roster with the lineup? $4 million. I think he's going to get his money. Like you said, 21 home runs. A team that's looking for power. Look at the money they spent on Olivares, on Michael Taylor, because of the power they'd put up the previous year. So I don't think the Pirates would look at that as a bad investment. He's a streaky hitter. That was what was told to us when he came over, and he got streaky in a bad way for Pittsburgh. If he can get hot, because Pittsburgh, yes, he doesn't profile well at PNC Park, but they play half their games on the road, so he's going to go places where he can hit home runs, um, and he's got a strong arm. But as we were talking, he just doesn't know what to do with the ball when he gets it. And I wonder if that's why he, you know, kicks him so much when he's trying to field these ground balls that come to him. And my suggestion to you was that the Pirates tell him, just spend all the offseason playing MLB The Show. Just have a quota of games to play every week. You'll figure out what base to throw it to and just translate it that way. Now, that being said, if the Pirates were in a position where maybe Andrew McCutchen was not in the picture, then maybe he profiles better as a designated hitter, and his on the field defensive woes aren't maybe living in his head a little bit, and they coming up to the plate. But we all love Kutch, and Kutch was productive last year. He had that power that I don't think many of us really expected from him at his age. And we'd love to ride with Kutch at least one more year. And if we could make it back to October with Andrew McCutchen in tow, I think that's a storybook ending for any career.
Yeah, and that's where this kind of lands with De La Cruz, is that he's a DH. I mean, I believe he is. And like you said, with his defense, I feel like he gets in his own head when he's out there just because of how much he bobbles the ball. I mean, and it's not even on like hard plays. It like bounces to his glove and he's trying to exchange it into his hand. And like you said, throwing it to the wrong base. We figured out that I was at the one game where he threw it to second base both times to let the runner advance to third base. And it's just something that, I mean, once again, if you are going to play poor at a certain thing, you have to excel at the other thing. And for him, it's always going to be the bat. And some guys, like, they're just not great defenders, like, kind of no matter where you put them at. Obviously, he's not going to play in left field because that's another center field, and right field was the best place for him. But yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, and I shouldn't say in a perfect world because people would be like a perfect world without Kutch, but in a world where you're building a competitive baseball team and you were to keep Brian De La Cruz on the roster, he would be playing, the majority of his games at DH. But I definitely think that they tender him. I believe, and I've seen it mentioned before, and it's something that you kind of brought up there a little bit, was that, people are thinking that, you non-tender Joe and you get that 3.2. You non-tender Brian De La Cruz, you're up to 7.2. You non-tender, Ben Heller, and then, you have enough to go out and get a hopefully more than competent outfielder. But like you said, we've got these extensions. It's not something that Pirates fans during, Ben Cherington's tenure have really had to deal with, because, Mitch Keller only making, less than $6 million last year. Well, we're, giving $8 million to free agent pitchers coming in. So he's making less than that. Now bumping up to almost 15.5. I mean, that money that you quote unquote just saved right there, it is gone
Yeah.
with that extension, even with those guys being cut. So yeah, back in the day when he first started, there was like I can remember when he took over. I believe there was like, you could basically, I think it was not pick up, oh God, who was it? You could not pick up an option on Archer. And then there was like pretty much like there wasn't really going to be like much
Right.
on the books. So you could
Polanco,
create,
yeah.
yeah, and Polanco. And then you could create like your own baseball team. Well, now, I mean, you've started handing out these extensions. Reynolds getting an extra $2 million. And something that I brought up before the show is that IKF, yeah, Toronto is eating, it's like 1.2 million of next year's deal. Well, that leaves the Pirates with almost 6.3 million. Last year at shortstop, you had a guy making league minimum. He moves to the outfield where you had a guy making 4 million. So take, Michael A. Taylor's 4 million, subtract it from what you owe IKF, and there's an extra $4.2 million that you owe on top of that. So, I mean, I think that, some of these, if there would be a non-tender, yeah, I mean, some of the guys we may agree, ultimately deserve that, but some of that is going into the extensions and then trying to fill those holes, but they may not be filled the way that, other people are looking at it.
Payroll goes up, but the team doesn't necessarily get better. You're not adding new talent in, and you're spending more money. Sounds like a nightmare for nutting, but it's the way the economics work. If you feel like you're building towards something, yeah, you got to pay these guys more money and look elsewhere. Maybe cut corners where you can to field a team that can win games.
Yeah, and we've said this a few times over the last couple weeks, I believe, is that when Ben Charrington says something, I mean, yeah, a lot of it is that word salad, but has regularly said over the past few years that the majority of the success of this team will be from within. It's going to have to be from, a Nick Gonzalez, improving year to year. O'Neal Cruz becoming more of that star that everybody wants him to be, while, Brian Reynolds plays consistently. Hopefully, Brian Hayes comes back healthy and plays consistently how he was. How, I mean, everybody hoped he would be, even on the lower end, which is like around a 3.5 to 4 WAR player just due to his defense, and below, like slightly below league average offense. And then Mitch Keller pretty much being the same pitcher he's been over the past 2 years, which is a guy that pitches really well each innings and maybe has a bad month and a half during the season, whether it be, in the middle of last season or the end of this season. I'd like to flip-flop those if we're going to push towards the playoffs, but I mean, you get that consistent stuff, but realistically, I mean, a lot of this is going to come from within. And luckily, some of those guys are on the cheaper end right now. Skeens, Jones, Cruz for another year,
You can get
Gonzalez.
Sawinski back and playing how he's capable of playing, and have him break out a little bit. I think that in the conversations that we've had over the last few weeks since I joined the show, Sawinski, I don't know if we've hardly brought him up at all. And so, if I know he didn't have a great year at AAA, but he's a guy that has the talent. Like we were talking with Bednar, when you've done it before, it's in there. He could be a real wild card for this team. Maybe he's successful, and you can but maybe you can move on from De La Cruz. But yeah, so Sawinski, I think, is a piece that is going to get a lot of attention this offseason.
Yeah, it's not somebody that we bring up a lot, and I think it's because he, like you said, performed so poorly, then went down to AAA, did not perform that great.
Out of sight,
But
out of mind.
yeah, but did have 26 home runs the year before and was above a 2 WAR player. And if that's his ceiling, I mean, that ceiling helps. Like every kind of little bit helps here. And I mean, looking at, most of the other numbers, and we'll go through these. And I think this one's, it can almost be like rapid fire because I don't think there's any questions on any of these. Dennis Santana, $1.8 million. I mean, you're locking that up, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what he did, I don't know if we can look for him to be the below 1.00 whip pitcher that he was for the over 44 innings he pitched for the Pirates. But if you're gambling on him being a solid piece and a solid bullpen piece for 1.8, I mean, that's an easy one. Joey Bart, 1.8.
Steal. Absolute steal.
I mean, absolute steal at this point in time, nearing an 800 OPS, the 13 home runs, 45 RBI. The one thing that I think that is overlooked with him and Nick Gonzalez at times is how clutch they were with. And I know that people say clutch isn't a stat, but Bill James came out and told me that he believes they made a mistake and that it might actually be a stat. I mean, those two guys are pretty clutch. If there's guys on base and you're getting those RBI, they're getting them in, and people want to look towards the Royals. And I always look towards the fact that, Bobby Witt Jr. and it was the Pasquatch, Vinny Pasquantino, and Sal Perez were all at or near or above like 100 RBI. And you have those guys in the lineup. I mean, like I said, absolute steal there. Colin Holderman, 1.4.
Yeah, yeah, I do that. I think that something that gets overlooked is the fact that he got sick, and what was the flu or whatever, and he was knocked out for spring training. And I don't think, just like we talked with Bednar, he got off on the wrong foot, and these guys are creatures of habit. And when you have that kind of bad start in spring training, it can plague you throughout the whole season. When you look at him when he's healthy and how he performs when he's 100% or close to it, yeah, I think that 1.4 is a number that I don't have second thoughts about.
No, and with Holderman, I mean, the thing that you mentioned is him getting like the Bradenton flu and losing 25 pounds and different stuff. And when he did come back from that, the IL, it wasn't really an injury, it was a sickness, but ended up pitching himself into an injury. Well, I mean, part of that, it possibly could be because he wasn't built up, to
Mhm.
pitch for the season. And he was trying to make his body do what it normally does. And it was doing that for a little while. And all of a sudden, his body just basically said, nope. Like, remember, you didn't like get the regular spring training. Didn't get the regular start to the season. Like, you're not built for this. So, I mean, if he comes back and he's stronger, then that's an easy one. And then Bailey Falter, $2.8 million
Do it.
for a fourth or fifth starter. I know that people are bringing him up as a trade option. I've seen that out there. And I think that people kind of just want to trade Bailey Falter Luis Ortiz to a little bit of a lesser extent because it's not one of the big name guys. But I'd have to look back in the annals of history. Maybe I'll call Jason Martinez here, Mr. Roster Resource. I've had him on the show before, and ask him if there was ever a rotation that had all right-handers for like an entire season.
That's my
Because
thought too.
usually you have that lefty just to throw things off, just to get certain guys out of the lineup, get certain guys that don't hit very well against it. I mean, yeah, Bailey fell off a little bit at the end of the season, but like I said, I always look at the whip, man. I mean, people will look at the ERA 4.43. The whip stayed below 1.3 no matter what he struggled with. And in Major League Baseball, if you're below a 1.3 as a starter, you're a starter. You're in
He's
a rotation.
efficient. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
very efficient. I mean, the Phillies believed in him. He got quite an opportunity with the Phillies. And then when he came over here, I was a doubter coming into spring training. I thought he was going to, last a few starts and then he was going to be gone. That's when, he would be the casualty with if Jones didn't make it out of spring training or when Skeens came up, I thought he was going to be the casualty and he proved, me wrong. He proved a lot of people wrong. And I do think that it's important to have a lefty in there. Hey, maybe you wedge him between Skeens and Jones or something to kind of break up a couple of flamethrowers. But then again, his fastball plays above the actual speed too. Um, but yeah, I think that it's a no doubter at 2.8.
Well, I was, a Bailey Falter. I wouldn't say believer. I wouldn't even say a truther. I was playing devil's advocate during the last offseason, the beginning of this season. And I looked back to his time in Philly, and it was, a couple years ago that he got almost 100 innings, and his whip was sitting at 1.216 as like a starter. And I always thought that there could be something in there. I didn't see him performing the way that he did, but the way that the numbers shook out at the end of the season, if that could be evened out a little bit, I'm not saying I don't want him to be brilliant, but if you could have him be, just, a middle of the road version of himself in that, then you have, a competent number, 4 or 5 for, a pretty cheap salary. And then you don't have to go out and pay a Martin Perez, like an $8 million to come in. You don't have to take a risk on, a Marco Gonzalez, even though, most of that, was being paid. I'd have to look through Ethan Houlihan's things, but there's portions being paid by everybody. And the Pirates weren't stuck with, most of that contract. But we have one more guy before we get out of here. And that's Johan Oviedo, $1.5 million. I think that's a lick 'em and stick 'em right there. I mean, just lock that up. But the one thing I will say is that I see people putting out their rotations for 2025, and I see Johan Oviedo's name in there a little bit more than I think I was expecting. And I just want to caution people on this. He's coming back from Tommy John surgery. I mean, I know that a lot of people don't follow the minors, but I know they've heard of, Braxton Ashcraft. They've heard of Mike Burrows, got to see Mike Burrows make his, major league debut. Those guys at most times are topping out at around 75 innings for the season. If they get to 100, that's like kind of like out of the ordinary. And at times, if you want a guy who, you'll still have control of for a couple years after that and want to see him, maybe work his way back into the rotation, I don't know how far they're going to push him. And especially since none of us have even seen him back on the mound or even throwing to know what he's going to do. So I'm just going to tell people just to pump the brakes a little bit with Oviedo. I absolutely loved what he did a couple years ago.
Yeah.
But I don't look for him to be the same pitcher this year. And I look for him, if anything, at times maybe could fill the role that Ortiz had in the bullpen. But I mean, you also don't know how he's going to return from injury. So, I mean, we could see a guy that pitches, 30 innings in the majors next year or not at all. I mean, we don't know. So for people that are just saying, okay, that's another arm for the rotation, just please, I would caution you on that one a little bit.
And when we look at the options that they have, they are luckily in a position where, barring injury, so knock on wood, they have a lot of options. And so there's no rush for Oviedo. You don't want to rush him back on something like this. Let him start at AAA, work his way back in, and then take your time and don't push your luck on him.
Yeah, and if anything, if you want to, look at maybe the silver lining of something is that he's a guy that if you, kind of work with him a little bit at the beginning of the season, temper, some of his expectations, keep down some of those innings and stuff, he's a guy that could be, there at some point towards the end of the season when, every pitcher is kind of getting worn out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Or, I mean, don't be surprised if he is a guy that makes it to a certain innings count and then you don't see him the rest of the season. But I just kind of wanted to put that out there. I mean, I'm obviously giving him the $1.5 million because we've seen the way that he could perform. But, yeah, I just – when people mention him in the rotation, I mean, like you said, there's a lot more names that we could look towards.